everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Anat Admati, and I'm a professor of finance and economics and the faculty director of the Corporations and Society Initiative, CASI at GSB. CASI engages in dialogue, learning, and leadership at the intersection of markets, business, governments, and society to promote accountable capitalism and governance. Our special guest today is David Enrich. He's the business investigations editor at the New York Times and the author of a recent book, Dark Towers. Here's the book. Ideally, I would have asked David to sign it physically, but we'll have to wait with that. It tells in many colorful, with many colorful characters and unique sources about the culture and governance of Deutsche Bank, a German-based bank founded in 1870, and particularly its adventures in the world of global investment banking, and special attention to the decade-long relations this bank has with a particular client, now the President of the United States. The book is fascinating and important for allowing us to discuss all the issues that we at CASI want to explore and engage on. It's always great to read a book where you really are familiar with the topic and even know some of the characters. So that was the case for me in Dark Towers. Some years ago, in 2013, I published a book called The Banker's New Clothes, What's Wrong with Banking, What to Do About It. In fact, how I first encountered David. And my co-author was German, who's followed very closely Deutsche Bank. In looking at the index of our book, and obviously I remember a lot of it, we mentioned Deutsche Bank a number of times and take on specifically the CEO that was there the decade that we were discussing, mostly 2002 to 2012, Joseph Ackerman. So they kind of were small elements of our book. I have to say JP Morgan Chase and Jamie Dimon were much the more star participants in the book. We often find corporate wrongdoings through whistleblowers. The star of Dark Tower is an unusual kind of whistleblowers. David will tell us about that in many ways. But the book also discusses how whistleblowers within the bank were treated. And he mentions in particular the story of one of them, Eric Ben Artsy, who in the last few years visited my classes here at GSB. It was called Power in Finance this year, called Finance and Society last year. And some of you may have taken and seen him. And we also discussed in the class his encounters with the regulators and with the justice system after he was fired from Deutsche Bank. Dismissing, demoting, and firing the whistleblower, of course, punishes and silences them. The star of your other book, David's other book, The Spider Network, Tom Hayes, was actually involved in manipulating LIBOR. That was a big scandal that we actually end the book with. And yet he thrived, and if anything, within the industry, got rewarded for wrongdoing and didn't get signals that anything was wrong. So the system within the banks encouraged rather than discouraged these practices. And this perversity is consistent with some finding in one paper that I'm familiar with, and that entitled The Market for Financial Advisor Misconduct. And one of the co-authors is our own and my own colleague, Amit Seru, who was with us last week as well, and many of you know. And this paper shows that repeat offenders that are caught by FINRA, by a self-regulatory agency, have an easy time finding jobs in the financial sector. Specific institutions like them a lot. They do not get damaged. So we have a market that works backwards on wrongdoing. The people who are ethical get booted out, and the wrongdoers actually thrive and or get rewarded. So that's a little bit of something for us to process. David Enrich was previously the finance editor at the New York Times and the financial enterprise editor at the Wall Street Journal, heading a team of investigative reporters. Before that, he was a Journal's European banking editor in London and a Wall Street Journal reporter in New York. He won numerous journalism awards, including 2016 Gerald Loeb Award for feature writing. His experiences and writings put him at a great position to inform and enlighten us. The plan is that after a brief introduction, David will describe some of the things in his book. He will be joined by Ben Ruxin, MBA 21, and one of the co-chairs of CASI's events committee. We have an awesome and energetic new group of 11 first-year students who've been working very hard since spring break to bring a lot of different kinds of programming and work on the issues that we care about. This is already our third event this quarter, and many more are coming, so stay tuned for that. I'm excited to really work with them for the coming year or more. After this conversation, Ben will ask some questions, and I will open it up for discussion. And with that, I turn to David. Please, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to meet all of you. I'm doing this from the comfort of my home in the suburbs outside of New York. And I apologize in advance. I have 2 little kids running around the house. So if there are any screams from people in the background, there's no need to be alarmed. It's just my children. So I thought I would just start off by telling you a little bit about the book. And I think the best way to do that is to give a brief overview of the history of Deutsche Bank. But before I go into that, I just want to give you a heads up that this book, Dark Towers, is about a bank. It's about Deutsche Bank, but it's also a story about human beings. And one of the ways I've approached business journalism over my career is to try to not think about institutions as just faceless kind of institutions that are devoid of people. In reality, all of the bad behavior and good behavior that happens inside banks or other modern corporations is made up of many individual decisions. And oftentimes those individuals are guided by the incentives that are provided to them. And so to me, that's kind of the framework through which I've viewed my reporting both on Deutsche Bank and just in the corporate world in general. And I think one of the advantages of that is that it makes a book like this a lot easier to read and a lot more fun to write and to report on, because it's really a study of humans and human psychology as much as it is a study of corporations and kind of business and economics. So Deutsche Bank is a really unique institution, and that's one of the reasons I kind of gravitated toward it even before Donald Trump became president and Deutsche Bank was put into a spotlight. The bank has been around since 1870, so this is its 150th birthday this year, and it was founded in Berlin as a bank that its real purpose mainly was to help German institutions, big companies really, spread their wings internationally. And 1870 through the 1890s, it was the dawn of the industrial era, and there were some big German companies that were, like Siemens in particular, that really needed help expanding overseas. And so Deutsche Bank very quickly, basically from the ground up, very quickly became one of the world's leading kind of banks that financed infrastructure projects and development projects all over the world. It wasn't just working with Siemens, it was helping companies build railroads, for example, all over the world. And it became, in fact, one of the leading financiers of railroads for governments, including in Russia and the United States and Asia, Central and South America. And for give or take its first 40 or 50 years of existence, that was Deutsche Bank's real MO. The bank did not even bother with retail customers, with individuals. Its sole purpose and sole mission was financing big institutions and companies that were looking to either German institutions that were doing business outside of Germany, or big institutions from around the world that were looking to get into Germany or into continental Europe. And this all worked pretty well. The bank was, it made some mistakes along the way, but it had a pretty good reputation and very quickly became one of the world's leading banks. And then in the 1930s, things kind of went awry. And that was because the Nazis came to power in Germany. And Deutsche Bank was faced with a choice, which was either kind of stand up in principle in opposition to the Nazis, or go along with the Nazis and do what it took to remain in power and remain in the good graces of the government. And Deutsche Bank very emphatically chose option B, and it quickly became essentially the financing arm of the Nazi Party, and it played a leading role in the execution of genocide, really. And the bank financed the construction of concentration camps. It financed the manufacture of poison gas. It helped the Nazis take gold that they had stolen from Jews and others and sell it on international markets to raise desperately needed hard currency. It participated in the Aryanization process all over Europe as Germany conquered countries and kicked Jews and others off of out of positions of control in big companies. And by the end of World War II, when the Nazis were defeated, Deutsche Bank was viewed in much of the Western world as a party to war crimes. And in fact, the bank's leader at the time was convicted of being a war criminal. And the US tried to liquidate Deutsche Bank. It thought that this institution was such a criminal entity that it really should no longer exist. And this seemed likely to actually happen. The Deutsche Bank would basically be deleted from the world. It would no longer be around, except that the British government intervened. And the British government had a stake in this because the UK was still owed reparations from Germany for World War I. And Germany, or the UK's view was that unless Germany had a strong bank kind of lead it out of the economic doldrums, the odds of Britain getting repaid the money it was owed from World War I were very limited. And so Deutsche Bank became kind of this champion in the post-war era for the rebuilding and reconstruction, not just of the German economy, but really of Europe in general. And so once again, as it had been doing in the pre-war era, Deutsche Bank became this leading financer of construction projects, infrastructure projects, and corporate lending all over Europe, and to a large extent all over the world as well. And so basically for the first 12 decades or so of Deutsche Bank's existence, from its founding in 1870 up through most of the 1980s, Deutsche Bank, with the exception of the Nazi period, was really, I think, a pretty good corporate citizen, and was a bank that had a clear mission. It stuck to that mission. It performed it well. And the bank had a fairly wide view of its responsibilities to its constituencies. And the constituents were not shareholders. The shareholders were one constituency, but there was the bank's leaders took a fairly, I think, viewed their obligations through a pretty wide lens. And so shareholders were one constituency that they needed to serve, but customers were another, and employees were another, and the communities in which the bank operated were another. And this is kind of today it looks like a very old-fashioned way of running a company. These days, the focus is almost entirely on satisfying shareholders and doing what is in the short-term financial interests of shareholders. But at the time, Deutsche Bank really stood out as I think, a leading example of a pretty strong system of corporate governance and a strong system of checks and balances that allowed it to not just focus on enriching shareholders in the short term. And then things started to change again. And this is where my story in Dark Towers really kind of, I think, it really starts to take off, which is that starting in the late 1980s and really accelerating through the 90s and then through the 2000s, Deutsche Bank decided that it needed to become a lot more profitable a lot more quickly. And looking around the world at the time, Deutsche Bank could see that, especially in the US, but also in the UK, the big successful international banks were not just doing what they had traditionally done. They were delving into new business lines and exploring new products and finding new ways to interact with clients and in the markets. And really what it meant is that Deutsche Bank, if it was going to continue to thrive in this rapidly globalizing world, it needed to get big on Wall Street. And what that meant was that the bank needed to basically from scratch build a formidable presence, not only in Wall Street, but in the City of London, not only buying and selling stocks, but getting into new types of financial instruments like derivatives, building a big presence in businesses like commodities. And it really needed to go from this old-fashioned kind of hidebound German institution into a global institution that was competing not just with other German or European banks, but with banks from all over the world. And that included in the US and in the UK, which, as a result of deregulation that was taking place in both countries, it had become much more profitable for financial institutions to take risks and essentially make big wagers with borrowed money. And so Deutsche Bank in 1989 bought a kind of mid-sized British investment bank, and that didn't really move the needle for the bank. So in 1995, Deutsche Bank hired a couple of people to essentially lead a makeover of Deutsche Bank and transform it from this kind of stodgy German institution into a hard-charging global investment bank. And the two people that I focus on most in the book, one is a guy named Edson Mitchell, who was this very charismatic, impulsive derivative salesman from Merrill Lynch. And the other is Joseph Ackerman, who had been a senior executive at the Swiss investment bank Credit Suisse, and Deutsche Bank hired him in around the same time. So both of these guys arrived at Deutsche Bank in the mid-90s. And Edson Mitchell, who is an American and grew up in Maine, and his father was a janitor, he felt this great burning need to prove himself to the world. And he became a visionary leader at Deutsche Bank, as he had been at Merrill, and started hiring hundreds and then thousands of people from all over Wall Street, but in particular Merrill Lynch. And it really pushed the goal became very clear, which was that they needed to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. And this was working reasonably well for a period of time. And Deutsche Bank went from being this complete non-entity on Wall Street to very quickly becoming one of the top players, especially in fields like derivatives. And one of the people who came along for the ride with Edson Mitchell was his good friend, who's a guy named Bill Broeksmit. And Broeksmit was the son of a Midwestern minister. He was someone who had been raised with a pretty strong moral and ethical compass. And he climbed up through the ranks at Deutsche Bank and became one of the people who really developed. He was one of the rare people on Wall Street I've seen who managed, despite all of the pressures to compete and to cut corners and to sacrifice principles, he managed to stick to his principles for a long time. And I'll come back to him in a minute. But Edson Mitchell ended up dying in a plane crash at the end of 2000. And his death sparked this huge tug of war within Deutsche Bank, basically for the control of the company. And the guy who ended up in control of the company very soon thereafter became Joseph Ackerman. And Anat mentioned him in her introduction. I mean, Ackerman becomes, in my mind at least, I think one of the most destructive forces in the corporate world of this millennium, I would say. And he made a very fateful decision shortly after becoming the bank's CEO in 2002 that he wanted the bank's profits to very rapidly increase. And his metric for doing that was that he wanted the bank's return on equity to hit 25%. And just for comparison's sake, when he set that public objective, the bank's return on equity was, I believe, 4 or 5%. So he wanted essentially a 6-fold increase in the bank's returns to shareholders in the space of about 2 or 3 years. And lo and behold, the bank actually achieved that profitability target. But the way it did so, it's kind of predictable, right? And if you tell everyone you need to, in the space of a few years, increase your profits by 400, 500%, it's pretty clear what's going to happen. And what happened, sure enough, was that Deutsche Bank started cutting a lot of corners. They, first of all, started jettisoning from any of their businesses clients or customers who were not enormously profitable. So the only people the bank wanted to do business with going forward were people whom they could make a tremendous amount of money off of. And the bank also started engaging all over the world in what would turn out to be very shady, in some cases criminal practices, whether it was laundering money for Russian oligarchs or evading taxes or violating international sanctions or manipulating markets or tricking customers and selling them bad securities or lying to governments and regulators. And the list goes on and on. But Deutsche Bank very quickly in the Joe Ackerman era became the poster child for financial recklessness and criminality in many cases. And this continued, but no one really saw it at the time, in part because Deutsche Bank, so the 2008 financial crisis arrives and Deutsche Bank becomes, these banks are falling left and right all over the world. And Deutsche Bank miraculously manages to survive the financial crisis and comes through kind of in a position of strength. The bank suffered losses, but they were very modest compared to what most of their competitors survived. And so the bank comes out of the crisis looking relatively unscathed, and its executives are feeling very good about themselves and are feeling that they, skated through this and, that they were so clever and managed to very, with great savvy, navigate this crisis. And this is where some more kind of another round of mistakes begins at the bank. Instead of really thinking hard about how they could use this position of strength to fortify themselves, the bank keeps funneling money into expansion and doubling down on risky activity, and doing so often with borrowed money, which was a business model that most other banks that had been very badly burned in the crisis, and in many cases bailed out in the crisis, most banks got the message that this was not a sustainable business model going forward. And they started really rapidly changing the construction and operation of their businesses. Deutsche Bank was lulled into a false sense of security by its relative success during the financial crisis, and just continued to step on the gas. And so within a year or two of the financial crisis ending, Deutsche Bank went from being kind of the toast of the industry, and Joe Ackerman was parading around, kind of basking in all of this glory. It went from being the toast of the industry to really being one of the great casualties of the crisis, because the bank was investors quickly decided that the bank did not have nearly enough capital to survive. The investors and analysts and the public could look at the bank's balance sheet and see that it was sitting on these mountains of derivatives that are very hard to value. And then allegations started to arise from whistleblowers inside the bank and from regulators that Deutsche Bank had been just systematically lying and deceiving people about how a lot of its assets, including these derivatives, were valued. And so a crisis of confidence very quickly engulfs the bank. And so I'll just pause there for a second, because this is kind of where I started entering the story myself. And I had been, as Anat said, with the Wall Street Journal in New York, and I moved to London in 2010 to cover the banking industry there. And everyone I talked to was kind of pointing their fingers at Deutsche Bank as the real problem child that I needed to be focusing on. And there's nothing that a journalist loves more than everyone kind of saying, look at this big bad bank that hasn't gotten its comeuppance yet. And so my colleagues and I really started paying a lot of attention to Deutsche Bank very soon after I arrived in London, so in 2010, 2011. And one of the things that we kept seeing was that not only were the bank's financial foundations very rickety, but there were all these allegations of really serious misconduct that had been swirling around the bank. And again, there was market manipulation, bribery, all sorts of stuff. And so my colleagues and I spent a lot of time looking into this, and we did a bunch of stories about it. But it was really kind of unclear where this was leading. This is another bank that was in deep trouble, but how much did it matter? How serious were the problems? And that changed, for me at least, on a Sunday morning in January of 2014. And on that morning, Bill Broeksmit, who was the executive that had come to Deutsche Bank from Merrill Lynch with Edson Mitchell back around 1996. And again, this is a guy who had kind of managed to climb up through the ranks of the bank, and had essentially become the bank's top risk management executive. And he was kind of the right-hand man to the bank's CEO at the time, who was a guy named Anshu Jain, who had succeeded Joe Ackerman. And Broeksmit had developed a reputation for being really the conscience of the bank in a lot of ways, and the person everyone would turn to when they had a question of ethics or morality or principles. And so he was in a lot of ways kind of the spiritual, or one of the spiritual leaders, I would say, of Deutsche Bank at the time. And on this Sunday morning in January of 2014, Bill Broeksmit was found hanging in his apartment in London. And his suicide sent, I think, real shockwaves through London's financial community. And a lot of rumors started circulating that my colleagues and I began hearing about, which was that Broeksmit had the rumor was that Broeksmit had a lot of concerns internally about how Deutsche Bank was being run, and he had supposedly complained to Anshu Jain about this, and that maybe that had something to do with his death. And so my colleagues and I started trying to figure out what had actually happened, why he had committed suicide, and what were the circumstances around his death. And I ended up getting in touch with Bill Broeksmit's son, Val, who was a musician who was living in London at the time. And Val and I started up what would be a 5 or 6 year relationship that, and I kind of had a ringside seat as Val went on this expedition to try and figure out why, in fact, his father had committed suicide. And along the way, Val made a really startling discovery, which is that his father had been using not just his Deutsche Bank email, but also his personal Yahoo and Gmail accounts to conduct a lot of business with the bank. And so Val got access to those personal email accounts, and inside he found thousands and thousands of emails, documents, PowerPoint presentations, loan documents, things like that, that his father had either sent or received on his personal accounts or had forwarded from his Deutsche Bank account to his Yahoo or Gmail accounts. And Val shared most of these materials with me, and it really provided this extraordinary inside look inside not only inside the bank, but inside the communications of the upper echelons of a bank that was not only engulfed in crisis, but also at the time was really trying very hard to pull the wool over regulators' eyes and the public's eyes and customers' eyes. And Ruxin emerges from all of these files as really one of the rare good guys inside the bank. And he had really been fighting very hard to do the right thing, and he was often losing those battles. And so Dark Towers, the book, becomes in a lot of ways a narrative of Bill Ruxin as this good guy within a bank who's trying to do the right thing, but is really tortured by what he's seeing. And then his son's efforts to not only come to terms with his father's death, but his quest to figure out what went wrong and understand why, and to ultimately punish Deutsche Bank for what he perceives was its role in pushing his father over the edge. And this was all like well and good, and it was a fascinating story for me, but it really changed in 2017 when Donald Trump was sworn in as the president of the United States. And the reason for that, as I presume most of you know, is that Deutsche Bank for many years had been basically the only well-established financial institution willing to do business with Trump. And it turned out, as I reported this out, that Deutsche Bank's involvement with Trump basically intersects exactly at the moment that Edson Mitchell and his kind of band of brothers arrives from Merrill Lynch and decides to turn Deutsche Bank into this Wall Street powerhouse. And so the narratives of Edson Mitchell and Bill Ruxin building this bank is kind of interwoven with the narrative of Deutsche Bank getting into bed with Donald Trump. And over again, even as Trump defaults on one loan or bond deal after another, kind of rushing back to him because the bank is so blinded by its, never-ending appetite for risk and for short-term profits. And so that is the story. I'm leaving out a lot because I don't want to ruin all the surprises for those of you who haven't read the book but might read the book. And with that, I'm very happy to answer questions from Ben and from everyone else.
Great, David, thank you so much for sharing it. Reading this, it was truly a fascinating story, and the kind of range of emotions that I had as I was going through it were, anywhere from shocked to saddened to just infuriated. It just kind of bounced from one to the next with each chapter. So we'll spend the rest of the time doing Q&A, as David said. I'll start by asking a couple of questions, but then we'll turn it over to the audience. So for those listening and watching, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to bring up questions to ask. So David, I wanted to start with that moment in 2002 when Joe Ackerman was, became CEO, and you cite that as this tipping point where Deutsche Bank truly took the plunge into this shareholder and really short-term shareholder mindset of trying to drive 25% return on equity. And it struck me as a very predictable decline that followed that. Like, it was such an insane jump in ROE that it seemed like that wasn't going to be sustainable. Can you take me through what is the shareholder value creation and the choice to pursue that tied to a more, I guess, unsustainable approach longer term? Did that have to happen, or was there a way that they could have said, we want to focus on shareholders but do it in a sustainable way?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think in general, and Anat is one of the world's leading experts on this. So, but taking a page from her book, I mean, look, banks play a very important and healthy role in a functioning financial system, right? There's the efficiently distributing capital from those who have an excess of it to those who have a deficit of it is an important role for banks to play. The more profitable banks get, in my opinion, and I don't want to put words in Amanat's mouth, but I suspect her opinion as well. That's a great thing for the bank's executives and the bank's shareholders, but that's actually not a healthy thing for a functioning economy, because it means the bank is extracting profits directly from the economy and from the financial system. And so in general, in my experience, when banks are earning these very high double-digit returns, they're doing so by some sort of economically and financially inefficient and perhaps abusive mechanism. And in Deutsche Bank's case, and you can see a change in behavior happen very quickly when Joe Ackerman sets this goal. And part of the reason for that is that Ackerman was known internally as, he is someone who is like in the Swiss military. He was not someone who suffered fools gently. He had an explosive temper, and people were terrified of disappointing him. And so when he said, we need to hit this target within X number of years, and really it wasn't X number of years, it was X number of quarters. His deputies very clearly set targets for their employees to achieve that. And that meant that you basically stop asking questions about the provenance of the profits. You stop asking questions about the riskiness of the transactions, and you look solely at, will this be profitable in the immediate term? And so you can draw a straight line from those pressures. Oh, and by the way, the compensation systems within the bank change. And so employees are all of a sudden, at least in the investment banking division, they're basically incentivized that they will get a percentage cut of whatever revenue they generate. And so, so if you make $1 million and you're going to get 10% of that, that's great for you. You get $100,000. If you lose $1 million 5 years down the road, you're not having to give back $100,000, right? So there's this very asymmetrical financial incentives created for employees. And so you can draw a very clear line between that and some of the activities the bank was doing in countries like Iran and Syria, for example, where there are very strict U.S. sanctions against doing business there. Deutsche Bank has a big U.S. operation, and it's just very clear the bank is not legally permitted to be doing transactions, at least in dollars, through its U.S. entities with places like Iran and Syria. And the bank made a conscious decision to do it, to violate the law. And you can see why, because they had, in the immediate term, they needed to make money wherever they could. And since most banks were adhering to the law, the demand for services violating sanctions went up, and the price therefore went up. And so it became very lucrative for them to violate sanctions. It became very lucrative for them to provide a wide array of money laundering services for Russian oligarchs. And so to answer your question, I think it is possible to satisfy shareholder returns, but I think there's something inherently dangerous about a bank trying to maximize short-term profits, and especially go essentially from 0 to 60 in the space of a few quarters. It means almost by definition that you're doing things you as a bank should not be doing.
And whose job should it be then to police that? So should that have been the board? Should that have been, some employees tried and they didn't have much success. Should that have been governments? Who really missed the ball here?
All of the above. I think the rank and file employees are probably the one, it's not really their fault. It is their fault, that's not true. But they're responding clearly to incentives. To me, the ones who are responsible for this culture of craziness that took over Deutsche Bank are immediately the top executives, but also the supervisory board, which is the equivalent of a US board of directors. And for sure, regulators. And the regulators all over the world really dropped the ball on this one. And the German regulators in particular viewed the oversight of Deutsche Bank as essentially propping up kind of a hometown champion. And not only were not regulating the bank and kind of keeping it in check, but were in fact doing whatever they could to protect the bank from supervision from other governments. But the reality is other governments weren't doing a good job of this either. The Federal Reserve in the US, which was largely responsible for regulating the bank's huge Wall Street operations, just completely dropped the ball as well. And the bank spent 15 years, and frankly, still to this day, is continuing to have huge problems with policing against money laundering, huge problems with producing accurate financial statements, is hugely addicted to debt from central banks. And yet the Fed has, keeps kind of slapping the bank's wrists to no effect. And so I think there's a tremendous amount of blame to go around. Frankly, investors deserve a lot of the blame. There's the bank has lost, the last time I checked, about 95% of its market value. And so, equity investors have been punished pretty thoroughly by this. But if a market is working as it should, there should be a lot of overlapping checks and balances, and they just systematically failed in this case.
Mm-hmm. And kind of staying on this note, we got a couple of interesting audience questions about the way that this wrongdoing, and also the way that Deutsche Bank's historical wrongdoing was remembered, or maybe, to put it more accurately, forgotten.
Yeah.
So, it seems that these banking scandals have limited long-term impact. I mean, as soon as the British were advocating for Deutsche Bank to be strong after World War II, people forgave and forgot very quickly. What would it take for these investigations and this evidence of wrongdoing to have more lasting consequences?
I think the reality is there's no way to do it unless you're going to start holding individuals criminally accountable for their actions. And by individuals, I don't mean the guy on the trading desk who said some stupid stuff in chat messages and is convicted of manipulating currencies market, although I'm sure that person also deserves to be punished. Mm-hmm. But the reality, from my perspective, having looked at a lot of banks behaving very badly over the years, and not just Deutsche Bank, in the Spider Network, my first book about LIBOR, this is true really throughout the industry for a very long period of time. The only way to change behavior up and down the food chains at these banks is to change the culture. And you need people, you need employees from the moment they set foot in the bank to be greeted with this notion that, look, we can cheat and you can make money by cheating, but that is not what we do here. That is not smiled upon. And that's not at all the message most people get when they walk in the door of the bank. You walk in the door and you sit through a compliance seminar, but you have to kind of go through these annual or semi-annual compliance training things. But the reality is you are told to just, like a heat-seeking missile, find market inefficiencies, do everything you can to exploit them, whether that means ripping off customers or cheating or whatnot. And to me, the responsibility for this, to a large extent, rests at the top of these institutions, where you have CEOs who often come from the investment banking sides of these institutions, who are doing a lot to create these very reckless and unprincipled and amoral cultures. And to me, the only thing that's going to change their behavior is for them to really feel like there are severe personal repercussions from them allowing these out of control cultures to persist. And the model over the past decade, in particular in the US, has been that CEOs, when their institutions fall apart, get fired. In some rare cases, they get some of their money clawed back, but that's rare still. And so people leave having been embarrassed and had some bad press, but they leave with their 9-figure fortunes intact. And to me, and talking to a lot of these senior executives, the thing that they care about and that they fear are their lives being ruined. And if the real threat of going to jail, or even being perp walked into a police station, or having to stand in front of a jury and a judge, that would put a lot of fear in people, and I think would really be a powerful way to alter behavior immediately. And I just don't think there's the political will really to do that in the US, but I think that would be the single most effective thing that we could do to really fundamentally change behavior in the banks.
Mm-hmm. And where does too big to fail fit into that, from the sense of, you mentioned that in the book that Deutsche Bank really couldn't fail. They probably would have been bailed out by either the German government or the US government. Is that a factor in their behavior and their decision making, and how do we address that?
Well, God, I don't know how to address it. I mean, there are a lot of people a lot smarter and more sophisticated on this than me that have spent the past 10 or 12 years trying to figure out how we solve that. And I don't think we have solved it, but I have no idea how to solve it. But I do think it plays a role, and I think it's a slightly subtle role. And no one that I've spoken to at a big bank is saying, okay, we're going to be much more aggressive in our risk taking because we know that if our risk taking all goes wrong, the German government or the US government is going to bail us out. That's just not, in my experience, the way people are thinking about this. But I think in a subtle way, it does play a role because it allows the knowledge that an investor in, say, Deutsche Bank has, that Deutsche Bank is not going to cease to exist. The German government will bail it out, and they have indirectly already, and they absolutely, in a pinch, they're not going to let one of their proudest kind of national icon companies collapse. And that knowledge makes it a lot easier for investors to buy the stock or the debt of Deutsche Bank. And that in turn essentially lowers the bank's funding costs and makes it a lot easier for them to operate profitably. And it makes it a lot more efficient and lucrative for them to continue with some of their very risky behavior. So I think there's this kind of cycle that we go through where it becomes self-perpetuating and it rewards bad behavior, but it's not as explicit as someone saying, okay, I know we're going to get bailed out if we mess this up, so I'm just going to go do it anyway.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit, we've gotten, probably not surprisingly for you, a number of audience questions regarding President Trump and his relationship with Deutsche Bank. Given the current crisis, how do you see the relationship and the massive amount of money that the president owes Deutsche Bank playing out over the next few months with the impacts to the real estate industry, the tourism industry, probably impacting some of those investments? Are they trying to, how do you see that playing out, and also how do you see the matter in the courts playing out with the president's financial information?
Yeah, this is something we're focusing on a lot right now. And just for background, Deutsche Bank, from 1998 to 2016, when Trump was elected, the bank lent him well over $2 billion in total. And he owed, when he entered office in 2017, he owed Deutsche Bank about $350 million. So Deutsche Bank is by far his largest creditor. It's lent him money when no other mainstream bank would get anywhere near him. And I think without Deutsche Bank's financial assistance over the years, I don't know that Trump wouldn't be president, but it would have been a lot harder for him to successfully campaign as a businessman who has been building lots of things. And Deutsche Bank was absolutely indispensable in that. And Deutsche Bank now and Trump obviously has been broken with decades of precedent and refused to release detailed financial information about himself, his family, his businesses, including his tax returns. And so Deutsche Bank right now, in addition to being the largest creditor to the president of the United States, is also in this weird position of sitting on a tremendous volume of his financial secrets, whether it's his personal financial statements or his corporate balance sheet or his family's bank statements. Deutsche Bank is kind of the repository for some of Trump's most detailed financial secrets that he's been fighting to keep private. And so there are two things going on right now that are kind of live issues. One is that, as you mentioned, not only the real estate market is getting hit by this current crisis, but Trump's businesses, he's specialized in golf, and golf courses are closed, and his businesses are getting really badly hurt by this crisis. And so we reported, I believe it was last week, although I'm losing track of time, that Trump has initiated, or the Trump organization has initiated discussions with Deutsche Bank about possibly restructuring some of these loans that are still outstanding, or at least delaying payments on some of them, which is pretty extraordinary because it means that the president's company, because again, Trump never fully divested himself from these companies. And so the president of the United States has a financial interest in a live issue with a big bank that is heavily regulated by the United States government, and in fact is under criminal investigation by the Trump administration, by the Justice Department. And so it's yet another extraordinary conflict of interest potentially between Trump's personal private financial interests and the public interests potentially. And we haven't seen that conflict really play out, but it's I think unprecedented, an unprecedented situation. And then the other live issue, as you alluded to, is that last year, two congressional committees subpoenaed Deutsche Bank, seeking all of Trump's financial records that Deutsche Bank was sitting on. And the Trump family immediately filed a lawsuit against Deutsche Bank, seeking to block it from complying with those federal subpoenas. And that has been going back and forth in the court system ever since. And I shouldn't even say back and forth. The reality is that one federal court after another has ruled against the Trump family and has ruled that that Deutsche Bank does need to Deutsche Bank does need to comply with these congressional subpoenas. And the Trump family appealed to the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case. There were supposed to be oral arguments on that a few weeks ago. Those got postponed because of everything was shutting down. And now they are going to have the hearing next month in May telephonically. And so that sets up a decision probably by the end of the Supreme Court's term in June on that, if the Supreme Court sticks with federal precedent, it will mean that Deutsche Bank is going to be handing over just, reams of information about Trump that Trump has been trying very hard to keep secret. And if, the past is any guide, if the congressional committees win this court case and Deutsche Bank hands this stuff over to Congress, it's not going to stay private very long. It'll pretty quickly leak out, and it'll be doing so right in the middle of the presidential campaign. So the question is, how does the court rule? And I am not a legal expert, and every prediction I make along these lines, I get wrong. So my guess is that the Supreme Court will push or will require Deutsche Bank to hand over at least some of the materials that Congress has subpoenaed. My guess is it won't be all of them, but I think it'll be a lot of them. And my guess is we'll be getting a much more detailed glimpse of Donald Trump's innermost financial secrets sometimes over the summer. But again, I want to bookend that by caveating it that I always get those kind of predictions wrong.
Yeah, you can't predict the future. Totally understand that. Pivoting a little bit, another topic that really is just right below the surface of this book is mental health. And a lot of us have come from very high stress workplaces. A lot of us are going to be going into very high stress workplaces. In your reporting for this book, did you come away with any ideas about how high stress workplaces can become healthier environments for their employees?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that, to be honest with you. And so the short answer is no. I mean, I focus much more on how stressful these workplaces are and how the banks, at least that I've looked at, and my information is a little bit dated on this, to be fair. So it's possible banks have gotten better about some of this stuff in the past year or two. But there have been in the finance industry in the US and in London over the past decade or so now, there's just been a very grisly pattern of employees, whether they're low-level people or even interns, right up to like the highest level executives committing suicide. And it's kind of an inescapable pattern. And obviously, and one of the things I've learned in working on this book is that it's very dangerous and foolhardy, I think, to try and say, person committed suicide for this particular reason. In most cases, it's much more complicated than that. And it's kind of unknowable. But I do think, at least in Bill Broaksmith's case, and it's very clear, and I've read the notes that he left to his family, and it's quite clear that among the things that was kind of pushing him over the edge was a feeling he felt under enormous kind of back-breaking pressure at the bank. But Broaksmith's case is interesting because it's not, the bank wasn't really, Broaksmith had kind of internalized a lot of the bank's failings and kind of was treating them as his own personal failings. And while that's understandable, it wasn't altogether rational, I think. And he obviously was suffering from some really serious mental health issues. I think he's clearly anxiety, depression, things like that. And look, I mean, I think just in general, as a society and in the business world in general in the US, we're very, very slowly becoming more comfortable talking about mental health issues and kind of trying to destigmatize those issues, because there are issues that, a ton of people deal with, and it's an illness, people get sick and people need to find the time and the space to address those issues in their own way. And they need the latitude and flexibility, not only from the companies to allow them to, have good mental health benefits or take the time to, take time off or have time during the workday to see a therapist or a psychiatrist. But also there needs to be, I think, and again, this isn't just in the banking world, but this is in corporate America in general, there really needs to be less stigma attached to mental health problems. And I think I'm starting to see that a little bit, but there's a long way to go. And I think once that gets destigmatized a little bit, it'll be a lot easier for people to kind of recognize their problems and for their colleagues to not perceive it as signs of weakness and to really address this head on. We're not there yet. And until we're there, I think you're still going to see some really, really awful, tragic side effects.
Yeah. That's a very thoughtful response. Thanks. Another interesting thing about covering Deutsche Bank in particular is that this story happened on both sides of the Atlantic. And could you speak more about like the similarities and differences that you saw both from a regulatory standpoint, from a culture standpoint, even from like a media standpoint, as you kind of went from one side of the Atlantic to the other in the reporting of this book?
Yeah, and the differences are really stark. So from a regulatory standpoint, and it's a really interesting backstory in Germany because after World War II, Germans were, really, it was a scarring experience, rightfully so. And one of the safeguards that Germany put in place just across the board was that there was going to be a new era of corporate governance that really reflected the society's distrust and fear of all powerful leaders. And so the way that manifested itself in the corporate world in Germany was that a lot of companies, including Deutsche Bank, had these overlapping kind of boards of directors. And so there is one board that was kind of what's the equivalent of an American board of directors called a supervisory board. And then there's another board of executives. And there's not actually, up until recently, most German companies didn't even have CEOs. They had someone who was elected as the leader of that management board of executives. And the supervisory board and the management board would often be deliberately kind of at loggerheads. And so there's a governance system that was deliberately set up to slow down decision-making, to add kind of a layer of checks and balances. And I think that was in many places in the German business world, that was perceived as enough of a check on bad behavior that the regulators really were not taking a very assertive approach. And in the US and the UK, historically, obviously there's been, there are boards of directors, but those traditionally have been filled with people that are really kind of in hoc, I would say, to the CEOs. The CEOs are often chairman of the boards of directors, and there's the notion of an independent oversight board is not really, that doesn't actually happen very much in the US. And instead, you're supposed to have these very zealous regulators that are scrutinizing every aspect of your business, especially in an area like banking. The reality is that on both sides of the Atlantic, those systems just broke. So in Germany, with Deutsche Bank, the power of the supervisory board was really diluted. Deutsche Bank adopted a CEO model, and the first CEO, Joe Ackerman, really took a view and was empowered to kind of be omnipotent throughout the organization. There were very few checks on his behavior from the supervisory board or from the German regulators. And in the US, which had all along had this system of kind of a unitary CEO, the regulators just really dropped the ball. And that, dates back to the Reagan era, continued through the Bush years, and really accelerated under the Clinton administration. And the same thing kind of happened in parallel in the UK during the Blair government. There was, starting the Thatcher government, but through the Blair years, there was really this notion took hold that big companies could be trusted to take care of themselves, and that, it was in companies' best interest to operate safely and to not fail, and therefore there's not a need for aggressive oversight. And that obviously proved to be disastrously wrong. But so in any case, in both cases, and the other thing, you mentioned the media, which I think is also a really important point. And I think in Germany, the media, Deutsche Bank is a very big, powerful company. It is well connected. It controls a lot of advertising dollars. And so the German media, with many notable exceptions, has overall been very reluctant to take a very aggressive stance on covering this big institution. And in the US, I don't think it's quite as dramatic with, I think the US, the financial business media, there's nothing really corrupt going on there. There's no one saying, I'm going to pull my punches because they're a big advertiser. The US media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, including myself, like, we've missed huge stories over the years, and the financial crisis being one of them, and have been kind of flat-footed on others, I think. But that's more accidental than by design, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. We are coming up to time. There's a number of other great questions that people asked, but I think we're going to wrap it here. David, I wanted to close by saying thank you so much for joining us today. To those of you who are listening, David is still a reporter for the New York Times. You can still find his coverage of Deutsche Bank's continued dealings with the Trump organization and over the course of this financial crisis. I encourage you to look at that. The book is Dark Towers. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm happy. I'm very active on Twitter, where my handle is @David Enrich. And I'm happy to engage in a dialogue on there if anyone wants to answer any other questions.
Thank you for that. And again, the book is Dark Towers. Please stay tuned for more events from Cassie. We've got an exciting spring slate still ahead. So look forward to hearing from more from us. David, thank you again so much for your time today. We really appreciated it. I know I learned a lot, and I think everyone else did as well.
It's my pleasure. It was fun.